To understand the king who thought he was made of glass, we first need to talk about France. And by France, I mean a giant medieval pressure cooker full of nobles, taxes, war, and bad decisions. At this time, France was stuck in the 100 Years' War with England, which, despite the name, did not last exactly 100 years. It lasted around 116 years because apparently medieval Europe was bad at both peace and math. France had already suffered decades of war, plague, economic crisis, and angry peasants with pitchforks. So naturally, the country needed a strong, stable, experienced ruler. Instead, it got an 11-year-old boy. This boy was Charles VI, son of King Charles V. His father had been known as Charles the Wise, which is a very good name to have before your son becomes known as Charles the Mad. Charles V had helped France recover territory and rebuild its strength. Then he died. Because history has a very annoying habit of removing competent people at the worst possible time. And now, 11-year-old Charles was King of France. Most 11-year-olds are worried about homework. Charles had to worry about taxes, nobles, England, and whether the entire kingdom would explode before lunch. Since he was too young to rule, the government was placed in the hands of his uncles. And whenever medieval uncles say, "We are only here to help," you should immediately hide the treasury. These uncles included powerful dukes who were very interested in protecting the young king. And by protecting him, I mean protecting their own power, money, and influence. The treasury began to suffer, taxes went up, the people were not thrilled. But for a while, Charles was still too young to do anything about it. Then, as he grew older, he decided he was done being a royal decoration. In 1388, Charles took control of the government himself. He brought back experienced advisors who had served his father. These men were not flashy, not glamorous, and most importantly, not his uncles. The people liked this. Charles became known as Charles the Beloved, a very nice title, very elegant, very promising. And absolutely doomed. Because history was about to take that beautiful nickname and smash it on the floor. When Charles became king, he was still too young to actually rule, so the kingdom needed responsible adults to guide him. Unfortunately, it got his uncles. And these were not the warm, friendly kind of uncles who bring gifts and tell funny stories. These were medieval power uncles, the kind who hear child king and immediately think business opportunity. They called themselves protectors of the young king, which sounds very noble. Until you remember they also controlled the money, the government, and basically everything useful. The young king had a crown, but his uncles had the power. This is a very important lesson in medieval politics. The person wearing the crown is not always the person running the country. Charles' uncles governed in his name, but they were very generous with one particular group of people, themselves. Taxes were raised, the treasury was drained, and the French people looked at the government and thought, "Wow, this is terrible." Which, to be fair, was a common thought in medieval France. Meanwhile, young Charles was growing up inside a royal court full of ambition, suspicion, and expensive hats. Everyone smiled politely, everyone bowed gracefully, and everyone was probably plotting something. This was the environment Charles had to learn to rule in. Not exactly a peaceful childhood, but then something surprising happened. Charles grew older. And he started to realize something very important. If he wanted to be king, he actually had to be king. So in 1388, Charles took power back from his uncles. Politely, of course, because this was France. You could ruin someone politically, but you still had to look elegant while doing it. Charles brought back his father's old advisors. These men were experienced, practical, and much less interested in stealing everything not nailed down. Under their guidance, Charles began to look like a promising young ruler. The people liked him. The kingdom seemed more stable, and Charles earned the nickname the Beloved, which is exactly the kind of nickname you want before everything goes horribly wrong. For a while, things actually looked pretty good for Charles. He was young, popular, and finally in control of his own government. Which, in medieval France, meant disaster was probably waiting behind a tree. In 1392, Charles decided to lead a military expedition himself. The mission was connected to a political attack involving one of his officials. So Charles did what kings often do when politics gets messy. he brought an army. Because nothing says reasonable investigation like hundreds of armed men. The army marched through the countryside toward Brittany. It was hot, exhausting, and probably smelled exactly how you think a medieval army smelled. Charles was already under pressure. He had the weight of the crown, the war, the nobles, and the entire kingdom pressing down on him. And then, in the forest near Le Mans, things got strange. As the king rode through the trees, a mysterious man suddenly appeared. He grabbed the king's horse and shouted a warning. "Do not ride any further, noble king. You are betrayed." Now this is not what you want to hear during a stressful military march, especially not from a random forest man who looks like he has been arguing with squirrels. The soldiers pulled the man away. The march continued, but inside Charles's mind, that warning did not disappear. It stayed there, repeating, growing louder, until one small sound pushed everything over the edge. A page's lance accidentally struck a helmet. It was probably just a harmless clang, but to Charles, it sounded like betrayal. Suddenly, the king snapped. He drew his sword and charged at his own men. He shouted that they were traitors, which was awkward because most of them had simply shown up to work that day. Several men were killed or wounded before anyone could stop him, and here was the problem. You cannot just tackle the king like he is a drunk guy at a tavern. He is still the king. So the soldiers had to stop him carefully. Very carefully. Eventually, they subdued him. Charles collapsed into confusion and exhaustion. He no longer seemed like the confident young ruler France had just begun to trust. He looked like a man trapped inside a nightmare only he could see. And for France, that was terrifying. Because if the king could not control himself, then who would control the kingdom? After the terrifying incident in the forest, Charles was taken back to safety. The court hoped this was just one terrible moment, a strange episode, a royal accident, something everyone could politely pretend never happened. And for a short time, it seemed like they might be right. Charles recovered. He began speaking clearly again. He recognized the people around him, and everyone breathed a huge sigh of relief. Great, they thought. The king is fine, but there was one small problem. Nobody knew if it would happen again. And when your king might suddenly attack people in a forest, that is not a small problem. The court needed a plan, because France could not just pause the entire kingdom every time Charles had a bad day. Taxes still had to be collected. Nobles still had to be controlled. England still existed, very inconveniently. So when Charles was well, he could rule. But when Charles was unwell, someone else had to step in. And that someone else usually had a very large hat and a very large ambition. The uncles returned to influence. The dukes returned to whispering, and everyone returned to the ancient French hobby of fighting over power. The result was a dangerous cycle. Charles recovered, and the kingdom relaxed. Charles got sick again, and the nobles sharpened their knives. Not always literally, but sometimes very literally. Because a weak king creates a strong temptation. And in France, temptation usually wore expensive clothes. This meant Charles's illness was no longer just a private tragedy. It became a national crisis. Every time the king disappeared into illness, power rushed into the empty space. The court became less like a government and more like a group project where everyone wants to be the leader. Which is bad in school, but worse when the project is an entire kingdom. And while the French nobles argued, England watched from across the channel, quietly, patiently, like a neighbor watching your house catch fire and wondering if your garden is available. France had survived wars before, but now the danger was inside the palace, and that was much harder to fight. Now, after a king suffers a terrifying mental breakdown, what is the most responsible thing a royal court can do? Give him rest? Reduce stress? Keep him away from danger? No, they threw a party. Because apparently, nothing heals the mind like loud music, crowded rooms, and medieval fire hazards. In 1393, the French court held a masquerade ball in Paris. It was supposed to be fun. It was supposed to be elegant. It was supposed to be a normal royal celebration. It became known as the Bal des Ardents, which is usually translated as the Ball of the Burning Men. And when your party title sounds like a disaster documentary, that is not a good sign. The plan was simple. Charles and several nobles would dress up as wild men. not wolves, not bears, wild men, which in medieval party logic meant covering themselves in flammable material. The costumes were made with linen, resin, pitch, and fibers that looked like hair. In other words, they basically dressed the king as a royal candle. This was not the safest idea, but luckily they had one very important safety rule: no torches near the dancers. Simple, clear, easy to follow, so naturally someone ignored it. The king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, arrived late. He was carrying a torch, which is exactly the kind of detail historians love, because it makes everyone scream internally. Orleans wanted to see who was under the costumes, so he brought the torch closer, 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 and then history did what history does best. It made everything worse. One costume caught fire, then another, then the entire room realized this was no longer a party. It was a disaster with snacks. People screamed, nobles ran, servants tried to help, and Charles, still inside one of those flammable costumes, was in the middle of it all. Somehow, he survived. A quick-thinking noblewoman shielded him with her dress, which is not usually how fire safety manuals are written. But in that moment, it worked. Others were not so lucky. Several men died from the flames, and the party became one of the most infamous disasters of the French court. So let us review. The king had a breakdown. The court threw a party. The party used flammable costumes. Someone brought a torch, and somehow this was considered entertainment. Medieval event planning was a dangerous profession. After the burning party disaster, Charles's condition did not simply disappear, it came back again and again. Sometimes he was calm and reasonable, sometimes he ruled like a normal king, and sometimes he did not recognize his own family. Imagine walking into breakfast, and your father, the king, looks at you like you are a suspicious chair. Not ideal for family bonding. At other times, Charles ran through the palace corridors in terror. Servants and guards followed him, not knowing whether to help him, stop him, or hide behind a tapestry. Some days he refused to bathe or change clothes, which made palace life difficult for everyone nearby. But the strangest belief was still to come. At some point, Charles became convinced that his body was made of glass. Not emotionally fragile, not poetically fragile, literally glass. He believed that if someone touched him too hard, he might shatter. So naturally, the court had to adjust. No rough handling, no sudden hugs, definitely no friendly shoulder slaps. In fact, Charles reportedly had iron rods sewn into his clothing. The idea was that these rods would protect him from breaking, which is either medieval medicine, medieval engineering, or medieval panic with a needle. But to Charles, it made sense, because in his mind, he was not simply afraid, he was fragile, breakable, one wrong touch away from disaster. Today, historians call this kind of belief the glass delusion. It was not unique to Charles. In later centuries, other Europeans also believed that parts of their bodies were made of glass. Some worried about glass heads, some worried about glass arms, and some worried about glass backsides, which made sitting down a major strategic decision. As strange as it sounds, the glass delusion made sense in its own time. Glass was rare, expensive, beautiful, and fragile. It was the perfect symbol for feeling special and breakable at the same time, and Charles was both. He was the most powerful man in France, and also terrified that one careless bump could destroy him. That is tragic, also very inconvenient for government meetings. Imagine trying to discuss taxes with a king who thinks he is a vase. Your Majesty, the treasury is empty. Please stand farther away from me. This was now court life. Not normal, not stable, and definitely not ideal for a country already surrounded by enemies and ambitious relatives. The king believed he was made of glass, but the kingdom around him was beginning to look just as fragile. Now, if Charles had been an ordinary man, this would have been a private tragedy, a sad story for his family, a difficult illness for the people around him. But Charles was not an ordinary man. He was the King of France, and when the King of France had a problem, France had a problem. Every fear in Charles's mind became a question for the government. Could the king sign this law today? Could the king meet foreign ambassadors today? Could the king be touched today? And if the answer was no, someone else had to make decisions. That is where things got dangerous, because power hates empty space. If the king could not rule, someone would try to rule through him. And in France, There were plenty of people willing to volunteer, very generously. Two powerful factions began to dominate the court. On one side were the supporters of the Duke of Burgundy. On the other side were the supporters of the Duke of Orleans, the king's brother. Both sides claimed they wanted what was best for France, which is politician language for, "I would like more power, please." When Charles was lucid, he could still be king, but when he was ill, the factions moved closer. Closer to the throne, closer to the royal seal, closer to the money. This made court politics about as peaceful as a bag of angry cats. The tension grew, the insults grew, the knives, metaphorical and otherwise, got sharper. Then, in 1407, things became very literal. The Duke of Orleans was murdered in Paris. Not accidentally tripped into a political misunderstanding, murdered. And the man behind it was the Duke of Burgundy. This was not a minor disagreement. This was the kind of disagreement that turns family drama into civil war. The supporters of Orleans formed a rival faction. They became known as the Armagnacs. Burgundy had his own supporters, and suddenly France had two political teams. Unfortunately, this was not a friendly tournament. It was a civil conflict, and it came at the worst possible time, because while France was busy punching itself in the face, England was watching. And England had a very simple thought. That looks like an opportunity. And France once again had created a problem so large that its enemies did not even need to try very hard. Charles was still king, but the kingdom was increasingly being ruled by everyone around him. The Glass King sat on the throne, and all around him, France began to crack. While France was busy arguing with itself, England saw an opportunity, a big opportunity, the kind of opportunity that makes a medieval king put on armor and say, "I should invade something." That king was Henry V of England, young, ambitious, and very interested in owning more France, which was rude, but historically very on brand. Henry claimed he had a right to the French throne because medieval royal families were basically one giant family tree with swords. Everyone was related to everyone, and everyone used that as an excuse to claim land. So Henry crossed the channel with an army. France, meanwhile, was still busy being France. The Armagnacs and Burgundians hated each other. The king was unstable, the government was divided, and England had brought longbows. This was not ideal. In 1415, the two armies met at Agincourt. On paper, the French had the advantage. They had more nobles, more armor, more confidence, and unfortunately, much more mud. The battlefield was narrow and wet, which is great if you are a duck, but less great if you are a heavily armored French knight. The French advanced, slowly, very slowly. The English archers fired, arrows filled the sky, French knights slipped, stumbled, and crashed into each other. It was like watching a very expensive traffic jam. Except the traffic had swords and worse insurance. The battle became a disaster for France. Many French nobles were killed or captured. Henry won a shocking victory. France, meanwhile, looked at its internal politics and said, "Maybe this is fine." It was not fine. Henry kept pushing. He captured more territory. He negotiated from a position of strength. And eventually, France agreed to the Treaty of Troyes. This treaty basically said Henry would inherit the French throne after Charles, which was a very bold thing to write down in a legal document, especially if you were Charles's actual son. Imagine checking the family paperwork and discovering your inheritance has been given to England. Not a great day. Henry also married Charles's daughter, Catherine, because if you are going to claim someone's throne, you might as well make it a family event. The result was bizarre. England was now tied directly to the French succession. The French heir was pushed aside, and Charles, the Glass King, was still sitting in the middle of the mess. If France had been fragile before, now it was practically wrapped in a bow and handed to its enemy. And somehow, the story was still not over. At this point, it is easy to look at Charles and see only the strange stories, the forest breakdown, the burning party, the glass delusion, the king who thought he might shatter. And yes, that is bizarre. Very bizarre. Extremely difficult to explain at dinner parties. But Charles was not just a funny historical footnote. He was a real person, a young man who had once been loved by his people, a king who had tried to take control of his own government, a ruler who, for a brief moment, looked like he might actually stabilize France. And then his mind began to betray him. That is the tragedy of Charles VI. He did not choose to be ill. He did not choose to terrify his court. He did not choose to become a symbol of national weakness. But that is what happened. Because medieval monarchy had one very serious design flaw. Everything depended on one person. One king, one body, one mind, and when that mind broke, the system broke with it. Today, we might talk about treatment, support, diagnosis, care, but Charles lived in a world that had none of that. No modern psychiatry, no proper medication, no therapist saying, "Let us unpack this." Instead, there were priests, physicians with very questionable theories, and nobles who mostly wanted to know who got to make decisions while the king was unavailable. Charles needed compassion. What he got was politics. And politics is not famous for being gentle, especially medieval politics. For years, Charles moved between moments of clarity and illness. In one moment he was king, in the next he was lost. Sometimes the kingdom had a ruler, sometimes it had a throne with a question mark sitting on it. And every ambitious noble in France noticed. They noticed when Charles was weak. They noticed when the court hesitated. They noticed when power became available. And that may be the saddest part. Charles' illness did not just hurt Charles. It opened the door for everyone else to hurt France. So when we remember Charles as the Glass King, we should remember two things. First, his mind was fragile. Second, so was the kingdom built around him. And both were under pressure. By the time France realized how bad things had become, the damage was already everywhere. The court was divided. The nobles were fighting. England had a very uncomfortable amount of influence. And Charles was still alive, still king, still trapped inside a role he could no longer fully control. Then, out of this chaos, a new figure appeared. A teenage girl from a small village, which, historically speaking, is not the usual solution to an international succession crisis. Her name was Joan, Joan of Arc. Joan believed she had been chosen by God to help save France. And in a country where the government had been acting like a broken chair, people were ready to listen. She supported Charles's son, the Dauphin. You remember him. The guy who checked the family paperwork and found out England had taken his inheritance. Joan helped convince people that he was the rightful king of France. She inspired soldiers, she lifted morale, and she made the English suddenly feel much less comfortable. Under Joan's influence, the French began pushing back. The siege of Orléans was lifted, the Dauphin was taken to Reims, and there he was crowned Charles VII. Which was a very big problem for England, because England's whole plan depended on everyone agreeing that Henry's line had the better claim, and then France went and crowned someone else. Rude, but effective. Joan's story would become legendary. But Charles VI did not get to enjoy that recovery. He remained trapped in illness, trapped in the palace, trapped in a body he believed could break. In 1422, Charles VI died. The man once called the Beloved left behind a kingdom exhausted by war, faction, and confusion. It was not the ending anyone would have wanted for him. But history is rarely kind to people who sit at the center of broken systems, especially when they are too fragile to escape. Yet after him, France did not completely collapse. Slowly, painfully, it began to recover. Not because the system was perfect, it definitely was not. But because people kept trying to hold the pieces together. Some with politics, some with armies, and some with a teenage girl carrying a banner. Charles VI never became the ruler France needed, but his story shows what happens when a kingdom depends too much on one fragile man. After Charles VI died, France still had to keep going, because countries do not get to simply close for emotional damage. The throne passed into a messy new chapter. Charles VII would continue the fight for France. England would not simply pack up and leave, because invaders are famously bad at taking hints. The war dragged on, the factions continued to argue, and ordinary people kept paying the price. That is one of the easiest things to forget in stories about kings. We remember the crowns, the battles, the strange delusions, the famous names, but behind all of that were people trying to survive decisions they never made. A king believed he was made of glass, but the peasants were the ones who felt the cracks in their fields. The soldiers felt them in their bones, the families felt them at empty dinner tables. So Charles' story is not just about madness, it is about pressure, power, fragility, and what happens when an entire country is balanced on a person who is breaking. Medieval monarchy liked to pretend the king was more than human, chosen, sacred, untouchable, but Charles was painfully human. He was afraid, he was confused, he was ill, and because he was king, none of that could stay private. Every episode became court gossip. Every weakness became a political opportunity. Every recovery became temporary relief. And every relapse reopened the question no kingdom wants to ask. What happens when the person at the top cannot stand? For France, the answer was painful. Civil conflict, foreign invasion, a broken succession, and decades of uncertainty. But there is another side to the story, because even when the system cracked, people still acted. They fought, they negotiated, they rebuilt. Slowly, badly, imperfectly. Which is, honestly, most of history. Charles became remembered as the Mad King, or the Glass King, but maybe he should also be remembered as a warning. A warning that power should never depend on one fragile body, or one fragile mind. Because when that happens, the cracks do not stay in the palace, they spread across the kingdom, and everyone feels them. So, what do we do with the story of Charles VI? Do we laugh at the strange parts? A king afraid of shattering, a court trying to govern around imaginary glass bones, a monarchy so dramatic it accidentally became a cautionary cartoon. Yes, a little. Because history is often ridiculous, but we should not stop there, because underneath the strange details is a very human story. Charles was born into a system that needed him to be strong, stable, clear-minded, almost superhuman. But he was not superhuman. He was a man, a frightened man, a sick man, a man carrying a kingdom that was too heavy for anyone. And when he broke, everyone around him tried to use the pieces. His uncles used them, the dukes used them, England used them, even history used them, turning his pain into a nickname. The Mad King, the Glass King, the king who thought he would break. But maybe the real question is not why Charles thought he was glass. Maybe the real question is why the entire kingdom was built like glass too. One fragile king, one fragile system, one country trying not to shatter. And somehow, it did not. Not because the king was perfect, not because the nobles were wise, definitely not because the parties were safe. But because history is messy, stubborn, and weirdly hard to kill. France stumbled forward, the war continued, the politics continued, the arguments definitely continued. But the cracks began to close, slowly, imperfectly, humanly. So the next time someone says history is boring, remind them of Charles VI, the king who was loved, the king who was feared, the king who thought he was glass, and the king who showed France what could break when power had no safety net. Because in the end, Charles was not the only thing made of glass, the kingdom was fragile too, and that is why the story survived. Not because it is only strange, but because it is painfully familiar. A person breaks, a system shakes, and everyone nearby learns how fragile everything really was.